Hello, I'm Alistair McIntyre, the web publisher of electricscotland.com. Electric Scotland is in fact the largest website to do with the history of Scotland and the Scots of both home and abroad. And I've added content to the site every single day, well 364 days a year for some 20 years. So as you can imagine, the resources on the site are absolutely huge. My purpose in doing this video is to discuss Brexit, the Brexit decision that the UK was now leaving the EU. Now I have to say that I was a vigorous campaigner to leave the EU, and I have been commenting in the newspaper sites and so forth for a number of years as to why I don't think the EU is any longer fit for purpose. But one thing to me is quite clear, is that the Leave campaigners, I don't believe, expected to win. And it's increasingly clear that they had no real plan for what we would do if we did vote to leave. And now what we're seeing is a mad scramble to try to get our decisions about where to go next. And so I wanted to kind of put my penny's worth in of explaining why I think it was the right decision, and also to suggest ways forward from here. So let me first by telling you why I was against the EU. Essentially because I'm an historian, and because I especially work on the Scots diaspora as well, I've always been interested in what the world is doing as it affects the UK and Scotland. And so that also meant that I was increasingly interested in what the EU was doing, because that obviously affects Scotland. And my conclusion came some years ago, because I could see a lot of unrest in Europe, in the EU countries, of the citizens of those countries getting generally fed up with the EU. And so when I was looking very closely at it, one thing that was fairly obvious is the EU was actually a declining influence within the world. I mean, there are figures to suggest that by the year 2050, the EU will only represent some 10% of the world population, whereas it represented 30% in 1950. And equally well, in 1950 it represented some 30% of the world trade, whereas by 2050 it's likely only to represent 10% of the world trade. Increasingly the future is in Asia, not Europe. Europe is in terminal decline because of an aging population and a reducing workforce. The other aspect is that globalization is gradually taking over. We certainly don't have a global government, but the global organizations are increasingly influencing the laws that we are then passed down to each individual country. Now, in the EU's case, some estimates are that up to 80% of the new laws coming out of the EU are merely a dressed up version of what has been decided at the global level. And frankly, I'd see no point in that. The other thing about the EU is they totally control any negotiations outside of Europe. So if we wanted to do a separate deal with the USA, we can't, because it's subject to EU regulations. I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about recently in Scotland is Scottish Steel. The two plants that we have in Scotland were really about to close, but at the last minute they managed to keep them open. But one of the problems is that China is dumping cheap Chinese steel, which in effect is closing our industries. Now, because we're in the EU, we have no control over tariffs. The EU make all those decisions about tariffs on the basis of the EU. So if the EU decide this tariff will go forth, we have to accept that. We have no way of changing it. Whereas outside the EU, we can put a tariff on cheap Chinese steel and thus protect our industry and the workers within that industry. The other thing about the EU is that the countries of the EU individually are not able to sit on the major organisations of the world. Like probably the most important one of the lot is the World Trade Organization, because the EU will represent all member countries of the EU at negotiations at that level. Now clearly, if Germany and France decided that this proposal is in their best interests, because they dominate the EU, that's going to go forward. Now if Scotland were a member of the EU, it would only represent 1% of the EU population. Nothing. I mean, if the policy that France and Germany were putting through was diametrically opposed to Scottish interests, Scotland could do nothing about it. They can argue until they're blue in the face within the EU, but they would have no say at the end of the day. And that's why I felt like, why be a member of the EU? But of course, I've kind of realised that just the other day, one of the top civil servants said, the problem with being 43 years in the EU is that today Westminster only have about 20 experienced trade negotiators. And they'll be up against some 600 very experienced trade negotiators within the EU, because the whole EU mechanism is trading with other parts of the world. So we don't need individuals doing that, because the EU does it for us. And that's why I think Nicola Sturgeon is so scared of not being in the EU, because if she wants an independent Scotland, the problem is we have no trade negotiators. So she would be totally relying on the EU to represent Scotland throughout the world, which would relieve her of the responsibility of building a dedicated team of people to take Scotland into the world. Because she has absolutely no idea how to go about doing that, the EU is a great place for her to plonk Scotland, even though it's not in Scotland's interests. But as I say, I see the stock market has already recovered on the whole. Certainly the pound is still suffering. But whether we like it or not, we're still actually in the EU for at least another 2 years. So we're subject to all the normal constraints and laws and everything of the EU. So nothing's actually going to change. So why on earth the pound should have been dropping to that extent, it makes no sense to me at all. But then if you look at the EU countries, and I think this is the problem that Scotland has in particular, Scots are so focused on the domestic market, both in Scotland and in the UK, that they don't actually see what's happening in the world. But if you have been reading, as I do regularly, the world press, I can see there's a lot of resentment within the EU and the citizens of the countries of the EU about how badly the EU is handling things and how often their decisions are against what the individual country and the citizens in it think should happen. I mean, for example, if we start to look at where the EU is now going, certainly with Britain deciding to come out of the EU, that's been a huge shock to everyone. And at the end of the day, all party leaders in the UK, all party leaders in countries around Europe and the world, the big banks, the big corporations, all told us we had to remain. And basically the English and Welsh in particular put two fingers up and said, no, we're not going to accept what you're telling us, because it's in your interests, not ours. But of course the problem is that Scotland voted something like 63% to 37% to remain. And that's triggered in Nicola Sturgeon's mind an opportunity to go for independence yet again. But if you look at independence, I mean, you just simply cannot accept what the SNP are saying. You have to question whether what they're telling you is the truth. And bearing in mind, they're extremely good at telling you the truth by omission. In other words, I'll give you an example. I wrote Nicola Sturgeon on the basis of our exports. And the letter I got back from one of our staff was to say that the EU is Scotland's largest export market. And that was it. But when you dug into those figures, you found that, yes, it is the largest export market, but 70% of those exports go to England alone. Now, if she'd added that bit to it, it would have made anyone think about independence, because we want to separate from our largest export market, in effect. And then, to me, if you're looking at the financial affairs of Scotland, there is no better place to go than Kevin's chock-a-block, because he's been doing an extremely good job of analysing the JERS report. This is a statement of Scotland's finances done by the Scottish Government's Chief of Statistics. And so, by pretty well anyone's account, these are accurate figures. And certainly with the oil going down so horrendously, whereas Scotland made a lot of money from oil over the years, today, if anything, they're losing money now, oil. It's not contributing anything to the Scottish economy. That is a huge plunge in income terms. So much so that I think, if I remember rightly, Kevin reported that Scotland actually has something like 7.9 billion deficit due to the finances of Scotland, because while Scotland raises just as much taxation pro rata as the rest of the UK, they have much higher spending. And that's partly due to the sparseness of the population in Scotland. So everything is more expensive on that basis. But nevertheless, it ends up being that our debt to GDP ratio is something like 9.4%. Now, if you look at the EU have rules and regulations like everyone has, and one of their rules is that no EU country should have a debt to GDP ratio of more than 3%. And if Scotland joined, it would have the highest debt to GDP ratio of any European country. So to become a member of the EU, I would guess they wouldn't want us, but if they did, Scotland would have to have a plan in force to implement. As soon as it signed the letter, they'd have to implement, which would mean they've got a plan to reduce that 9.4 to the 3% level. And that can only mean increased taxes and reduction in public expenditure. And the impact on Scottish people would be immense to do that. But the SNP are not going to tell you that. So, but on top of that, we have the Barnett formula here, which delivers a stack of money to Scotland every year. And if we're going to leave the UK, we'll have to find that money somewhere else. And with oil giving nothing back to the Scottish economy at all, and I might add, the EU and the SNP in particular caused the loss of our fishing industry, which can no longer come back. It's now dead. I mean, there may be a few ships left, but basically our fishing industry is now dead in the water. And it's due to their policies. There's no way it can recover because we've now lost all the skill sets, the net makers, the boat builders. We've just lost the industry that needs to be around fishing industry. So it's now dead in the water. So where is Scotland going to go if it's going to become an independent country? I just cannot see any way in which Scotland could succeed as an independent country today. That's not to say it can't succeed as an independent country 10, 15, 20 years down the road. But I believe right now, all of this discussion about Nicola Sturgeon saying we must join the EU, we must remain in the EU, that's also a load of rubbish. I mean, she's just come back from negotiating to some degree, or at least talking to the EU people in Brussels. Now one, that's strictly speaking illegal, but good on her for fighting for Scotland. And she said she got a lovely warm welcome. Well, of course she got a warm welcome. Everyone likes Scotland. And of course Scotland voted to remain, so quite naturally everyone's cheerful with Scotland. But the hard practicalities are every country looks after its own interests and is quite vicious when it comes to doing that. So Spain sees Scotland in the EU as being a total betrayal of their country's interests. And they've made it perfectly clear they will veto Scotland's application to join the EU. Or if there's a special deal made where Scotland can remain in the EU while the UK exits, they've also vetoed that as well. The French president has also vetoed any idea of allowing Scotland in if the UK comes out. He said basically if the UK leaves, Scotland leaves. So the hard facts are Scotland's not going to get into the EU under a Brexit agreement. But she'll spin it like anything. She's a past master at spin. But the facts speak for themselves. Spain's not going to say, oh, well, we'll give up some of our problems so that Scotland can join. Because it just doesn't work like that. Everyone defends, I mean, she's passionate about Scotland, but Spain is passionate about the Spanish people. And they will defend Spain to the last breath. And if that means destroying Scotland, they'll cheerfully destroy Scotland. Even though they might like them. Because it's not in Spain's interest for Scotland to be in the EU. And that's what you're seeing in lots of countries in Europe. And all 100% of the EU members, all 27 now, would have to agree to let Scotland in. If even one vetoes it, Scotland's dead. But as I say, why would Scotland want to be in the EU? The only reason they want to be in the EU is that the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon are totally unprepared to deal with the world as an independent country. And they feel the only way they can handle that is by letting the EU make all the decisions for us. And as I've already said, I don't think it's in Scotland's interests. But the EU has nothing in place to build trade negotiators and diplomats. Nothing. They haven't even put education in place, which is a devolved matter. They can insist that the universities have special courses for training our diplomats and trade negotiators of the future. But there's absolutely no sign of them doing anything like that at all. They're woefully unprepared for independence. So the idea of having a referendum on Scottish independence within the next 2 years, to my belief, is just totally ridiculous. And if we by some chance she did get it through and we voted to be independent, Scotland's going to be hit for 6. In fact, the pain that Scots will suffer under that decision will soon show them that Nicola Sturgeon had no interest in them and only wanted their goal, which is independence for Scotland, under any circumstances. I mean, let's be practical. If the UK leaves the EU, which it now is going to do, and Scotland was in the EU, which I doubt if it would get in anyway, but if it did somehow manage to get in, we would have to put up borders. There would have to be border control. There's no doubt about that at all. And so that's a border to where 70% of our exports currently go. It's just unbelievable that she thinks she can get it through. But because the devolved government in Scotland also has total control for education, and we're already seeing that our education system is suffering and continuing in decline, it's in the SSP's interest to actually have a dumber population, because the dumber they are, the more likely they are to accept whatever the SNP says. That's in my view. And I'm highly biased against the SNP, because I say they are past masters of spin, and they can lie by omission very well indeed, only giving you partial information. Now, if we talk about immigration, which was a big factor in all this, all we're really saying is that the reason immigration has come up is because of the millions from the Middle East trying to get into Europe. And certainly, if you talk to a plumber in Wales, he'll tell you his business is going down because these new immigrants are willing to do business cheaper than he's able to do, and they take the business away from him. So, but ordinary people in ordinary lives are starting to see an impact because of immigration. But on a security aspect, Germany needs more workers. Germany is on quite a steep decline in their working population, which is a major problem for them in the years ahead. So one fell swoop, they can get 1 million new workers into Germany. That solves a lot of Germany's long-term problems. So they're open. But the UK, on the other hand, do not have that problem. We don't need to bring in any more than we're already bringing in. If anything, we should be bringing in less than we're bringing in. But at least we should be checking and doing a good job to make sure that people that do come to our country are legitimate people. We need to do the background checks and all the other things that need to go on. But once you're in Scotland, you're in. I mean, there's one of the big newspapers was talking about the Poles in Scotland. Well, I've got to tell you, the Poles are very, very welcome in Scotland. They have no reason to fear at all. I mean, back in the old days, and I'm talking a couple of centuries ago, Poland was seen as the mother of Scottish entrepreneurs. Something like 30,000 Scottish families were in Poland. It's where the nobility sent their second sons and others to learn about being merchants. Because they go to Poland, Poland fed them, clothed them, and enriched them. And I've got a quote on my site that says that. So the people that are in quite legitimately are happy. And I don't think Scotland has a particularly racist mentality anyway. We're happy for people of all walks of life to be in Scotland. Very happy. All we're saying is, how many more immigrants do we need? And the ones that come in, we just want to make sure they're safe immigrants to bring in. But in any event, because of this huge immigration crisis, one of the major points of the EU is once you're in the EU, you had completely open borders. And I've seen that because I've driven through Europe. And I've gone from one country to another. There's not even a border post in a number of these countries. You just drive straight in. So that's why I think immigration became an attitude, but it was more that we wanted to make sure there was proper controls in place. And as I say, Germany, to try and now prevent any more coming in, is doing €1 billion deals with Turkey to prevent many more coming in and crashing into Europe. But we have seen a lot of the European countries putting up their own borders because they were getting flooded as well, and they just couldn't handle it. I mean, if you look at poor Greece and Italy, they've been inundated with people coming in. But these people don't want to stay in those countries. They want to go on to Germany, France, and the UK. So what we're now seeing is borders appearing within a previously open border organisation. So as I say, my belief is the EU is heading down the way. Now, I think what I've tried to show with that little bit of information is that a second referendum for Scotland makes no sense whatsoever. Scotland remaining in the EU also makes no sense because the EU is in decline. And too many people in the EU are against the EU now, and they want to get their country back so they can make decisions for their country that's benefit to them. I mean, I think it was Marie Le Pen who a lot of people believe could well be the next president of France in the 2017 elections. She's actually said that if she does become president, she will call a referendum of whether France should remain in the EU, and she personally believes that France should come out of the EU. And as I say, if you look at Italy, I mean, I think their top bank in Italy since the beginning of this year has lost some 60% of its value. 30% anyway, but 30% as a direct result of Brexit. And I think the Italians are starting to look very closely at whether they should remain in the EU. I say because Britain's voted to the left, it's certainly changed the whole political spectrum of the EU. So if Nicola Sturgeon was able to remain in the EU, well, the question is, will the EU still be around by the time she gets into it? She could well make the most seriously bad decision for Scotland that a Scottish First Minister has ever made. She could go down in history as the most stupid person that we've ever had running Scotland. Her reputation could be in shreds when the historians get to write about her. She could go down as an actual traitor to Scotland. It's that serious. But let's look at where we are now. Because we're going to leave the EU, we are now able to negotiate trade deals with the rest of the world. We're not now constrained by what the EU decide to do. So what we need to do is we need to build up our trade negotiations and our diplomatic corps to go out there in the world and fight for us and make new deals that will make us prosperous. And one of the ways we can do that, I believe, is by reconnecting with the Commonwealth. I mean, we're in the Commonwealth, but we used to do a lot more trade with the Commonwealth until we joined the EU. Because of the EU controls on tariffs, we were no longer able to do the deals with like New Zealand, Australia, India for that matter, that we once were able to do. So now I think we can reconnect with them. And there's something like 2.3 billion. There's something like 2.3 billion people in the world. 2.3 billion people in the Commonwealth. That's a massive market, and their GDP is huge as well. So that's a bigger market than the EU that we could be going after, and we all speak the same language, which is a great benefit. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there. And the Queen, who's the head of the Commonwealth, could be very influential in getting everyone to start talking together about trade. But I mean, if you look, for example, that India's been trying to get a deal with the EU for 9 years now. And there's nothing in sight to that. I mean, we're even close to a deal. But now that Britain is freed of the EU mechanisms, I'm quite sure we'll be able to do a really good deal with India. and get billions of trade going between us. And as I say, Asia's the future market, and India's a big player in that market. But then if we look at while we're out of the EU, we're still one of the permanent members of the Security Council, we're still in NATO, none of that will change. So how do we deal with the USA? Well, I'm going to tell you, we're probably going to do better deals with the USA than we would have through the EU Parliament. I mean, I'll give you a URL in the comments when I put this video up to read my text overview on the site. Within that page on the site, I've got links to further reading. And I think it'd be quite revealing if you click on some of those links and learn for yourself what's actually happening. I think you'll see that the current negotiations between the US and the EU are totally against most people in the EU. I mean, they're trying to get a situation where American corporates will be able to take countries to court if they do anything against their interests. That's not good. I mean, for example, genetically modified food is an issue, and I know within the UK the laws against it are pretty draconian, but America looks at it from a point of view that they will manage the risk. And we don't take that view in the UK, or for that matter the EU. But that deal, that would have gone, and we'd had to accept it. It would have had a major impact on our National Health Service, which is very dear to people in the UK. So there's a huge amount of problems on that trade deal alone. And it's a bit the same with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, by the way. The same things are going on there. And I think people are beginning to think, why are we opening it up? I mean, Donald Trump in the USA, for example, he's against a lot of those deals. Because he's basically saying, yeah, we give people free trade to America. And it said, as a matter of fact, he said a lot of American companies are moving out of America to get cheaper labor, and they're selling goods back into America with no penalty whatsoever. He basically thinks that's fundamentally wrong. And I would agree with him, I have to say. That's why I think he's done so well in that getting the Republican nomination. What happens, of course, at the end of the day with the presidential nomination is, or the race is up to the Americans. But at least he sees the issues. And increasingly, I think other countries in the world are seeing the problem with these so-called trade deals. So I think we could negotiate better deals with the USA, because we're still a favoured friend. The special relationship is still there. I don't think that's going to change. But I think we just have so much opportunity. But we have to rebuild our diplomatic corps and our trade negotiators and build the experience so we can be really good trade negotiators. So I think the future is there. I think the EU is definitely on the way out. I think that's now the past. And I think over the next couple of years that will become more obvious as more countries demand a referendum. So we're the first to crack that EU thing open, but I think having put the crack in, I think the other countries will start just exploding. So that's my view on the Brexit. I think it's been a great decision for the UK to have voted to leave the EU. There are certainly challenges for the way forward, and as I say, I think we are unprepared. We were unprepared, but now that we've made that decision, the thinking caps are going to go on, and I'm quite sure in short order we'll get ourselves in order to negotiate with the world. I mean, we will have to now rejoin those global organizations like the World Trade Organization and so forth. We'll have to rejoin them now, so we'll need to have people in there. So that means a whole new rank of diplomatic people to represent us on those international trade organizations. So there you go. that's my kind of brief take. So in summary, I think it was a good decision for the UK to leave the EU, because I think the EU's dead. It might take time to die, of course, but I think it's on its way out. I think Scotland would be stupid to put a second referendum on the table, because frankly we can only be losers if we voted for independence. And I say, even if we did, I genuinely doubt that we would be allowed in to the EU, given our present financial circumstances. And as I say, I think the future for the UK outside the EU is just ginormous. But as I say, do read my more considered and more detailed summary of the situation on the web page, and as I say, just look below to the description and you'll get the link to it. So I hope that's made you think, and obviously I'm very happy to take questions or anything, and bearing in mind that on that page I have a comment system, so you can log into it and add your own comment. You can ask questions, critique what I've read, or whatever. Okay, so thank you for listening, and obviously we'll look forward to seeing what happens in the months and years ahead. Thank you.